Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon. Welcome to the Compensation Committee. John, Mr. Weech, would you take the roll for us, please?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Unterman.
Here.
Ms. Dillon.
Here.
For the Director of Finance, Ms. Ortega. Chairperson Keeler, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Hope everyone enjoys your new seat assignments. It's kind of big changes around here. We changed our seats. If you like them, Jack will get the credit. If you don't, I'll take the blame. But these are our new seats. Hope everyone enjoys them. Anyway, let's get started with item number 1, which is the approval of the committee agenda. Entertain a motion for approval, please.
So moved.
It's been properly moved and seconded to approve the committee agenda. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Thank you. Item,
Probably an overwhelming vote, wasn't it?
yeah. Item number 2 is the approval of the minutes from April the 1st, 2015. Entertain a motion to approve, please.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Item number 3 is the adoption of the revisions to section 700B of the board's policy manual. This is our third reading, and Ms. Licknock will take us through this. Cassandra?
Okay, thank you, Chair Keeley. There's a number of things that we were tackling when we were evaluating the policy revisions for this item. When we started out, we were looking at separating the policy from procedures, and we worked with the board's governance consultant, Amy McDuffie, to start separating the policy from procedure, and that's how we initiated the review of the policy. During that period of time, however, the committee had also asked that there be an in-depth review into the incentive criteria in the asset classes and the total fund relative to the benchmarks that are established and the weightings of the various asset classes. So we incorporated a review by our investment consultants, Pension Consulting Alliance, and Makita, who provided opinions on changes in those areas.
I do want to note, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Michael Oak is, I believe, on the line for this item, so I just
No,
want to...
he's on the next item.
Next line,
Yep.
coming on,
Yep.
he's on hold. Okay, thank you.
on hold.
Thanks.
Yeah. And they did not consult on this item, actually. The third thing that we had, that we conducted a review of was some policy changes relative to addressing the parameters around which we move salaries within the prescribed salary ranges for the statutory positions. And then we also had some technical housekeeping changes that we looked at and did some cleanup language around. At the last meeting, so we did that initial review in February with the proposed changes. And then in April, we did the second reading, and we had our compensation consultant, Global Governance Advisors, at the request of the committee, conduct a 10-year look-back stress analysis on the difference the incentive awards would have produced with these new benchmarks. And so in their opinion, they had determined that there wouldn't have been a significant difference in the achievement of the incentive awards except in the area of global equity active component of that asset class, where it would have reached the maximum threshold more often than it actually did achieve in that one particular asset class. And then there was also a question from the Department of Finance relative to the piece where we have a recommended change in the payout of incentive awards for employees who separate from CalSTRS after they've completed the plan year, but before the incentive award is actually paid to them. And the question that was posed was, does that change the vesting of the incentive award? And we have exchanged some communication with Ms. Ortega on that point. We sought some legal clarification, and it does not change the vesting of the incentive award. The vesting of the incentive award has already occurred. Upon, as long as the parameters of the policy have been met within the conditions of the plan component. So what we're doing is changing one of the components of the policy to allow for the payout of incentive awards if somebody completes the plan year and fulfills all of the performance criteria within that plan, and but leaves the system before we actually issue a check. And then the other piece that was still not, that we needed to close the loop on is whether or not that changed any tax consequence to an employee if they separated after the plan was completed, but they left the system, and if that incentive was deferred, did that have a different consequence than was already described in the policy, and it does not. So those are the things that were raised at the April meeting. One of the other questions that was raised by Mr. McGuire of the Controller's Office was he asked for the analysis that had initially been done by Pension Consulting Alliance and Makita on the recommendations for the benchmark changes in the asset classes that are listed. I have provided that back to the board, and I've asked both consultants to be present for additional questions for the committee if they would like to ask them that. So we have Laura Wyrick from Makita and Neil Rue from PCA here to address any questions. So that is the summary of where we are in the third reading. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And if you have any questions for the consultants, they're available as well.
Questions or comments from any of the board members? Mr. Boykin.
Thank you. The treasurer's not a member of this committee, but I think I brought this issue up on his behalf before. If I haven't, I apologize. I think I have, though. But on page comp 22, the first line strikes out the cap on the increase that the board can give for the base salary adjustment to the CEO and the CIO. And it's the treasurer's position that understand why that's there, that we always get this situation where we do the salary survey and we can't move to the midpoint. But at the same time, the treasurer's position is that most of the state workforce is subject to a 5% merit salary adjustment, or in a good year, a 2 to 3% salary bump. And so for those reasons, he would like to leave the language that caps the increases to 10%.
Ms. Dillon.
Staying with page 22. We're changing under for all other investment and executive management positions. We're changing the range from 0 to 10% instead of 0 to 12.5 to provide a standard measure of base pay percentage increase.
Right. The reason why we made that change is because there was a difference between what the parameters were for the board moving salary for the CEO and CIO than there was for the CEO and CIO making salary movements for the other statutory positions of the investment directors and portfolio managers. So we wanted there to be consistency, so at least some parameter that's established that the general salary increases will be 0 to 10%. Now, for extenuating circumstances, the board or the CEO and CIO may make adjustments outside of that for compaction issues or recruitment issues or other things that we may have to address. So that we just wanted those to be consistent because it was 0 to 12.5% for the other statutory positions, and then it was 0 to 10% for the CEO and CIO.
But aren't we proposing to do away with the 10%? So there isn't a need for a standard measurement of unit unless we put back in the 10%? See, I couldn't understand what it was because to provide a standard measure of base pay percentage increase, I totally understand that, and it ought to be similar to other limitations, but it seems like we took away the limitation and then changed it to meet a limitation we no longer had.
Well, I think that it says, unless I'm misreading it, it says base salary adjustments may range generally 0 to 10% up to the midpoint of the salary range, and the CEO has the discretion to grant an adjustment exceeding 10%.
Absolutely, and that's the number that we changed and made 0 to 10 instead of 12.5.
Yeah.
but there's no longer a number to match the 10 with. Unless we want to put the 10 back in.
I'm not following, I don't think.
Okay.
10%.
I think it, the 10%, whether it's 0 to 10 or 0 to 12.5, I like the 10 better. And I agree why it was changed. It's just that the reason why it was changed no longer exists because it's not measuring up to anybody else.
I think Mr.
You understand, just the rationale of why we did it, why we changed it from 12.5 to 10, was to make it standard, except there was no longer a standard to make it that way. So are we,
Because we're taking it out for the CEO and CIO altogether, oh, I see.
unless we want to,
Oh, I
mean,
see what you're saying.
for me, the rationale just didn't make sense.
So either,
And I'm perfectly fine with it being 10, if we think 10 is most appropriate. But let's not use the excuse that we're trying to match it with something else that doesn't exist any longer.
I see what you're saying. Well, it's up to the pleasure of the committee. We could either, for consistency, we can either take that out, or we can have the same language with the CEO, CIO, that it's generally 0 to 10% with the board having the discretion to adjust beyond that for the reasons that we have for the other.
Is there a limit of adjusting beyond that?
Well, it's always going to be within the salary parameters that you,
within the-
right, yeah.
Harry, you have anybody else online?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Start with 14.
then I'll come back to that then.
Okay.
Then my second question, Cassandra, is there is on 141. So on 22, we talk about, well, starting on 21, we do our base salary adjustments, and there's a line that talks about the whole part of the section of the policy with that. And then we split it up into CEO and CIO, and then for all others,
Which page are you on? I'm sorry to get that.
moving from 21 to 22 into 23.
Okay.
The first paragraph that's on 23, it's kind of like a conclusion to that whole section, but because it's put underneath all other, it's still referring to salary adjustments, either by the board or by the CEO. So I think that paragraph would be better after the lead-in paragraph on 21. Because it's talking about base salary adjustments in a broader sense.
I see what you're saying. That would be fine, from my perspective.
All right, thanks, Harry.
So it'd be a
What page is that?
continuation of that, it would be a continuation of that one sentence that's kind of
Yeah.
sitting by itself as a paragraph.
Absolutely,
Okay,
because it's speaking about the base salary adjustments in a broader sense, and then we narrowed them down.
okay,
And just keep that broader sense all in the same place, people won't get confused.
got it, okay, that makes sense.
Thank you. And I'll come back, Harry, if I want to change that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just also wanted to echo Mr. Boykin's point with respect to the 10% limitation on page Comp 22. I think the goal of the change, or the stated goal of the change, is allowing more, or to allow board discretion for base salary adjustments for the two positions, but I think this is also in recognition of the environment in which we're working, which actually the paragraph does refer to at the end. But I think having the limitation actually stated the 10%, I would like to see that kept in place as well.
Ms. Ortega.
Thank you. I would concur with keeping the 10% on Comp 22. And then I also wanted to just, as I've mentioned in past discussions of this item, I have a lot of reservations about the issue of providing incentive payouts to employees once they've separated from CalSTRS. I remain concerned about that, but I would note that the staff have added a section to the disclosure report on the incentive awards, where that if a person receives an incentive who is no longer employed, it would be part of the report. And I think that would allow the board to see if there was any pattern that was concerning or created any kind of incentive to leave around a certain time, or, created any issue that we should revisit at a later time. So just want to note for the record, I still have the reservations. I think it's problematic for the state to send checks to people who are no longer employed for bonus payments, but hopefully the transparency part of it will alleviate any of those potential concerns.
Ms. Ortega, having raised that issue in the past, and we've discussed that, as it's currently written with the transparency, are you comfortable with this going forward?
Yes,
Thank you.
on that item, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ortega. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Okay, seeing none, I'll leave the one issue that on page 22 should reflect the comments relative to the 10% was raised by at least 2 committee members and also Mr. Boykin on behalf of the treasurer. So I would like to see that be changed and keep that 10%.
So keep the 10%
Yeah,
maximum.
to reflect the comments of folks that have spoken, and certainly would be a majority of us. I don't think we need to go through each person as, okay? With that one change, is there any other changes, questions, or comments that the committee may have relative to this item? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve the recommendations to the changes with that one adjustment which was just noted. I'm sorry. Ms. Dillon.
So Cassandra, when we were talking about it, you explained that the CEO and the CIO, when they're having conversations about other investment and executive management positions, they have the ability to go beyond that 10% if circumstances warrant. If we return the language to biannual amounts not to exceed 10%, does that give the board the same flexibility?
No. And this, at least that's what has been in the past. The reason why this policy change was investigated was because when we made the salary adjustments for the salary ranges for all the statutory positions, our staff that were currently incumbents in those roles were significantly below the salary ranges. And in the discussion at the full board level, there was the consideration of trying to get them to the minimum, but it would have been, we were constrained by the policy parameters of 10%. So we had the majority of our staff under the minimum salary ranges because we were operating within the policy as it is defined currently. And the discussion was if we wanted to move beyond what the policy parameters were, we needed to make that change to the policy and allow the board of discretion to address the circumstances should, if and when they come up, for them to have discretion to move beyond that. So that's why we moved forward in looking at this to try to make that change, because it took us 3 years to get staff into the minimum range. And the conflict that it presented to us is when we were recruiting externally, we were potentially hiring external staff at a higher salary than our current incumbents were getting. And so it was difficult, but we just now we're getting into the minimum salary ranges. And again, the discussion as we moved, as we were discussing this, was not only where we couldn't get them to the minimum, if there was a desire by the board or anybody else to move them closer to the mid-range because there was recognition that salaries had been stagnant for a long time, or their tenure in the organization, the competencies that they have, that they're bringing forth, there was still no ability to do that. We had to not only couldn't get them to the minimum, we had to stay below the minimum. So that's what we were trying to address.
I totally agree. So how do we gain that same flexibility as a board when we're talking about the CEO and the CIO? Because if we just put back in the language, not to exceed 10%, we're tying our hands if there's ever a circumstance where we might want to go beyond.
Well, what we were trying to do is, have, if, what we could do, I mean, I hear what the controller and Ms. Ortega has brought up, and Mr. Boykin, that there's a concern about not having at least a threshold. What we could do with, which is what I think that you were suggesting, is have generally the parameters are this, but if for extenuating circumstances, and I think we have them described fairly well for the other statutory positions, arise, then the board has the discretion to do that. So,
Similarly to marrying the first paragraph, or the first sentence in the last paragraph,
yes.
I would be satisfied with that, and so would move it.
And those are two different,
Yep, yeah, so that we're all on the same page.
I'm just
Yeah.
moving that
Right.
addition to this language.
Basically, the suggestion then is that there would be some language speaking to, under extraordinary circumstances, some discretion would be given to the board to adjust above that 10%, or no?
yeah, what I think I hear her saying is that the TRB has the authority to adjust the CEO and CIO's base salary ranges within the prescribed ranges, and then put, which will be generally 0 to 10%, up to the midpoint, and then the TRB has the discretion to adjust it beyond that for these other considerations, similarly to what it's described in the paragraph
I'd
for.
like to just check with Ms. Yee and my colleagues, are others comfortable with that language? Where the general practice would be the 0 to 10%, but under some extraordinary circumstances, the board would have some authority to go above that 10% range.
Not to have the hard cap of 10%.
I guess I would still like to see the hard cap of 10% with what Cassandra just described. Because I do think the factors that are included in the current paragraph now are the things that we would look at that could lead us to the conclusion that we might want to exceed the 10%. But I just think given the environment in which we're operating, the 10%, I would prefer to see it from there as a hard cap.
Okay, very good. Okay, so with that, and are there any other suggestions, comments, Dana, that you have, or? No? Okay, so entertain a motion to approve the.
Can I get clarity?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
sure, go ahead.
So, my understanding is that they will generally not exceed 10% unless unless the board decides to exercise its discretion to consider other factors in going beyond
Can I
that.
just add something? I would suggest if in fact that's something that is drafted and put into the language, that it also state that action would be taken and those deliberations would take place, if appropriate, publicly. So that there's more transparency around that. Under those unique circumstances when the board determines that we want to exceed that 10% cap, that those deliberations and decisions would be made public, and not just reported out, if that's appropriate. Brian?
There are some considerations. Certainly take that as marching orders to look at that from a legal standpoint. Sometimes these are tied to performance discussions that are particularly personnel related. But you're talking about exemplary performance, so we may want to, talk about that in a different context. But again, I agree that we will try and do what we can to push the transparency, but I just want to make sure that I understand all the nuances of putting that in the policy with that specific direction from the chair.
Ms. Ortega?
I don't really see the value of adding the language that says unless there are extraordinary circumstances, because I think when you get to the point of the extraordinary circumstances, then you need to have another meeting, in which case the board can come back and act to, as we would say in legislative language, not withstand the 10%. So you could come back and say, we're going to modify the policy, or we're going to do something different from what the policy is in a properly noticed board action. because of the extraordinary circumstances. Putting the extraordinary circumstances language in there as a way to avoid the 10% during the deliberation of the compensation seems, to me, then no point of having the 10%. So I think that's similar to what you were saying, Harry, about having some transparency around it. Once you get into the circumstances of having the extraordinary issue, I think we could come back as a board and change our mind about the 10%.
I think those are very wise words. I don't think we have to, my thoughts is we don't have to discuss that any further. We're not gonna put the extraordinary circumstances into the language. That's very wise advice, and we'll take it when we hear it, unless there's some objection. Okay, so we're not gonna have anything about extraordinary circumstances. Ms. Ortega articulated how we can accomplish that goal if a future board wants to go above 10%. Ms. Dillon?
I totally agree with taking the words extraordinary circumstances out of it, but I'd rather have, my goal is to give this board the same flexibility that we're giving our CEO and CIO. I don't think if we find ourselves in a position where things are extraordinary, that we want to come back and in essence change our policy because of the circumstances. I'd rather have our policy give us the flexibility when those circumstances arise, because then it looks like the driver, instead of giving ourselves the flexibility now, it looks like the only reason why we're changing our policy is so we can do it at the moment it happens. And I think that's a worse optic than it would be for us to do so now, to give ourselves that flexibility. So I would just like to have the same authority mirrored between the board and our executive officers that they get to do with their staff.
Mr. Unterman?
With all due respect, I feel a little bit like we're dancing on the head of a pin here, but I do think there is a difference in latitude, as Ms. Ortega has pointed out, between what the board can do, which we can react on our own motion to extraordinary circumstances by board action, and what the CEO can do, where he or she would have to come back to the board to ask for extraordinary circumstance relief were it not in the policy. So I do think the two square, and I just really don't know that it makes an awful lot of difference how they read. So if the public members, public office holder members are more comfortable one way, I'm happy to go along with the format they prefer.
Okay, seeing no one else in the queue, I believe there was a motion, was there? Ms.
There was
Dillon?
a motion to change the language, yeah,
To change the language.
but I didn't have a second, so it died.
Okay, so it died. So, is there a motion on the floor to adopt the staff's recommendation with the 10% cap? And if there is, we can move forward.
So moved.
Yes, yes, the whole item, yeah, the whole item. So it's been moved by Mr. Unterman, seconded by Ms. Ortega. Any further discussion? Does staff need any clarification? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No,
The motion passes. Thank you. Item 4. This is the item in which Mr. Oak from Makita will be joining us.
McLaughlin,
Oh, excuse me, from McLaughlin, I'm sorry.
right.
McLaughlin is joining us on the phone. And while I turn that item over, I'd like to acknowledge in their official capacity, our fiduciary counsel is in the room with us today from Reed Smith, Mr. Lieberman, and his colleague. So they are formally here with us in their official role as fiduciary counsel. Nice to see both of you with us today. Item 4, Cassandra.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Keeley. This item is the evaluation of the maximum incentive opportunity for our Director of Investment Operations. The position of Director of Investment Operations was created in 2007, and the maximum incentive award was established at that time at 30%. This position is the only one that does not have a graded-in component moving into a newly appointed person going into the role. In comparison, the maximum incentive opportunity for our portfolio managers and our investment directors are 75%. And the newly approved classification of associate portfolio manager that has been created is 40%. So in consideration of the fact that we have a new classification that we are introducing into the investment branch, we thought that it was time for us to look again at the maximum incentive opportunity of this position to ensure that we're in alignment with what the pay incentive should be for the position, particularly in consideration of those associate portfolio managers that may be reporting to the position. We did not want them to have a higher incentive opportunity than the director of that unit. So Michael Oak had conducted an analysis of and review of the incentive component of that position, and they did provide a recommendation to adjust the incentive, the maximum incentive opportunity to 50%. Their presentation is the recommended incentive opportunity at 50%, but they also provided a recommendation, if the board does choose to make the adjustment, to have a graded-in formula in alignment with the other positions that we have that are incentive eligible. So the graded-in formula would start at 30% and go to 40% and max out at 50% at the third year for a newly appointed staff person. And I'm not sure if Michael, I'm thinking you're on the phone, if you wanted to add your comments relative to your presentation?
Sure. So can everyone hear me okay?
A little bit louder, please. Thank you.
On Comp 87, it says proposed incentive opportunity in the top left-hand side of the page. So the one thing that Cassandra didn't touch on, which we think is important and how we came to that 50%. So that 50% was both looking at the current opportunities in terms of your internal equity between the APM and COIO classifications. But we also wanted to look at the competitive market data for that based on the board-approved comparator group. So if you look at the middle of that page, Comp 87, there's a chart that says, the first column says Director Investment Ops salary range, which is the current range. There's no changes there. The proposed incentive at 50%, and then the total cash opportunity, which at the low end of the range would be 246, the midpoint 308, and the high end 369. And that corresponds to the next column of the market competitive total cash, the 25th percentile being 259, the median being 314, and the 75th at 392. You see the variance over to the right, that a fully proficient at midpoint of the range would be 308 versus the median of 314, which would place you at 2% below the median. So the 50% was derived both from looking at this competitive market data as well as where that position would be aligned with the APM and COIO classifications. And then the bottom of the page, two alternatives there. So if you wanted to be consistent with the other positions, a grading in of 30, 40, 50 seems to make sense. And then if you don't have grading, it would obviously just be the 50% in each year. So happy to address any questions that you have.
Any questions from the committee? Ms. Ortega.
I don't have a question, just a comment that it seems that there's the pressure that created the need for this item is related to the decision we made on the assistant portfolio manager position. And I think it would have been helpful to have this discussion at that same time. So I think as we think about positions and changes in the future and ways of broadening classes and things like that, it would be good to have a bigger view when it's brought to the board about what might be the collateral effect of those changes, so that we have that in mind when we're making the previous change. I don't have a concern with the analysis that's provided here, and in the past I've supported the grading, so I would support that again today as well.
Thank you, Ms. Ortega. Anyone else? Okay, seeing none, this is an action item, and on Comp 84 is the recommendation for those changes.
Just what,
Ms. Lick, yeah, Cassandra.
if the board is going to take, the committee is going to take action, I do need which one, if it's going to be 50% or the graded in, so.
Okay, Ms. Ortega has moved the item with the grading in proposal. Is there a second for that?
Second.
It's seconded by Ms. Dillon. Any discussion on the recommendation for the graded in approach? Seeing none, all those in favor of adoption of the graded in approach, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, the item passes. Item 5 is our work plan for next year, Cassandra?
We are really trying to get all of the work done in 2 committee meetings next year in the hopes that we can be more efficient in our time. So November, we have the start of the compensation consultant solicitation process. We have a pool of compensation consultants that their contracts are going to be expiring, so we're going to initiate that process. So we'll be bringing to the board the statement of work, the types of activities that you might be interested in having them perform for you. And then we'll undertake that work after the board approves that. We will be evaluating the compensation structure of new statutory positions that we hope to have approved through the legislative process. And then at the request of, I think, Mr. Unterman, he had asked that some of the authority be delegated to the CEO on some of these classification items that are coming to the compensation committee relative to new classifications, salaries, and items such as that. So that is an item that we would be bringing back in November. And then, of course, the disclosure of incentive awards for the positions that had received those. In April, then we would interview the compensation consultants and make a selection on who would be in the pool and probably identify who the primary consultant would be. We would conduct the committee work plan input, and then we would look at finalizing what authority was going to be delegated to the CEO. So those are the key things that we would be working on.
Our CIO, Mr. Ellman, has a comment. Good afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, Chris Ellman, your Chief Investment Officer. I just don't want to propose any change to your work plan. I just want to plant a flag, because many of you haven't been on this committee for a long time. In your policy and historically, you reviewed the comparative universe. You know, you did a salary survey of what everything else is going on out there every 2 years. This would normally have been the year in which we did that. But just due to everything taking so long last year and defining the group, we're not doing it. Puts us out of sequence with some of our peers that we do recruit from. So we'll see where I don't think salaries changed a whole bunch, so I don't think they're gonna see much movement or we'll see much movement, but just, keep that in mind. We're skipping a year in your 16-17, just to get a little too far ahead, but you're gonna wanna make sure after you can pick your consultant that you go back and do your salary survey. And I think it's important in this competitive market in the investment world to keep that fresh and to at least do that every couple of years.
Thanks, Mr. Ellman. May the record reflect that the flag he planted was green and white. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. Don't you, Chris? Green and white.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
The flag you planted was green and white. Yes, sir. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Item, anything else, Cassandra? That's it, right? Item 6, information requests. I don't think there were any. Item 7 is the draft agenda for the next committee, which is in November. That is when we report out publicly the incentives that may be awarded in October at our offsites, and that, again, is done independently. We have someone independently look at those numbers and calculate those, and then we report them out publicly in November.
Correct.
Anything else that you want to point out for that? I don't think so, right,
Uh,
Cassandra?
No, starting in November, we do have our new Human Resources Director, Melissa Norsha, who will be staffing the committee, so she's somewhere. She's probably hiding. No, there she
Yes.
is.
Great.
So
Welcome.
her name's here, and
Yes.
she'll do a wonderful job.
Mr. Unterman?
This is going back an item on the agenda to the work plan. And given Chris's comment, which I think is a really serious one about just getting way off cycle in terms of compensation reviews, and a year in the real world being a really long time, I was wondering if the staff couldn't think of a way to truncate the process such that we could make a decision and hire somebody in November and be able to stay closer to cycle.
Let's hire somebody to do the
Compensation
salaries.
consultant, rather than
Well,
waiting till.
we still have somebody, we still have a pool of consultants, so we're,
Maybe you just clarify what the pool of consultants, for
Right, we
some
have
of
a-
us to know.
yeah, we have a pool of consultants. One of them is McLaughlin Partners, who was just speaking about our compensation. They still are on, they're still available for us to use until their contract expires. We're just moving forward to renew that pool. We'd already extended the contract. So we're not gonna have a lapse of, our inability to do work yeah.
Okay, that answers it.
You're also not handcuffed right now. I mean, it's good to keep them fresh, but because you raised them so much last
Right.
time, we don't have really many employees that are even close to being at the top. We're still working through the ranges that you raised last time because it has been so long. I mean, it's not true entirely, but there are a few employees that are at the top, but
All right, and then maybe I misunderstood the nature of Chris's concern.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, item 7A is the opportunity for statements from the public. Would anyone like to address us? Seeing none, the committee is adjourned. Thank you.